The bitter wind of a late November evening swept through the historic streets of Boston, carrying with it the unmistakable bite of an approaching winter. Richard navigated the crowded pavement shortly after 7 o'clock, holding one hand of each of his children as though they were still toddlers learning to walk, rather than fiercely independent elementary school students. Luke, always the quiet and analytical one, protested this overprotective gesture in absolute silence, simply furrowing his dark brows and staring intently at the cracked concrete beneath their boots. On the other hand, Lily laughed brightly into the cold air, squeezing her father's strong fingers tightly and loudly declaring that on this particular evening she would be the undisputed queen of the dessert menu, choosing the final sweet treat for the entire family. The bustling, chaotic energy of the Massachusetts capital kept the broad avenue brilliantly illuminated. A vibrant tapestry woven from the headlights of passing cars, the distant muffled horns of frustrated taxi drivers, and the glowing, inviting storefront windows that lined the historic district. It was as if the ancient city desperately wanted to hide its deep structural fatigue behind a shimmering veil of artificial lights and perpetual motion. For the young twins, however, none of this urban chaos mattered in the slightest. Their minds were entirely consumed by the promise of the warm, baked pasta, the ice-cold fruit juices they were rarely allowed to drink, and the sacred, unbreakable promise of staying awake exactly 30 minutes past their usual, strictly enforced bedtime. Richard finally paused and pushed open the heavy brass-handled glass door of their favorite neighborhood restaurant, and the family was immediately enveloped by the profoundly comforting rich aroma of simmering garlic fresh tomato sauce, warm sourdough bread, and robust coffee beans that had just been freshly ground. The restaurant, affectionately named Oliver's Hearth, was not ostentatiously luxurious, despite being firmly situated in an increasingly expensive and highly sought-after zip code. It stubbornly maintained its old-world charm, featuring simple red and white checkered tablecloths, pale cream walls adorned with faded framed photographs of the local harbor, and veteran waitstaff who possessed the rare ability to greet their regular customers by their first names, while remembering their exact dietary preferences. Perhaps that was precisely why Richard, a man who navigated a world of superficiality, cherished this unassuming establishment so deeply. Within these warm, scuffed walls, nobody ever treated him like a famous, widely interviewed technology entrepreneur. Nobody looked at him as the wealthy, calculating owner of towering commercial buildings and multi-million-dollar government contracts. Here in this safe haven, he was simply the devoted father of Luke and Lily, the familiar, softly spoken man who always requested the exact same circular table by the front drafty window, and the patron who consistently left a tremendously generous cash tip without ever making a loud, boastful show of his immense wealth. Mr. Oliver the Seasoned. Silver-haired owner, whose family had run the establishment for 3 generations, displayed a broad, deeply genuine smile the moment he saw them enter the crowded foyer. He playfully called the twins the little professors, asked for highly detailed serious updates about their recent elementary school science projects, and personally escorted the 3 of them to their favorite quiet, comfortable table, perfectly nestled in a dimly lit corner. A young waitress named Clara, who was currently working her way through a difficult nursing degree at the local university, quickly approached their table with a warm, tired smile, bringing them a basket of steaming bread and 3 tall glasses of ice water without even needing to be asked. Lily practically threw herself into her wooden chair before anyone else could even sit down, dramatically opened the large leather-bound menu completely upside down, and pretended to read the complex Italian descriptions with intense scholarly seriousness, successfully drawing a quiet, genuine chuckle from her usually stoic brother. Luke, who was perpetually the more observant and silent of the 2 children, placed his heavy school backpack carefully on his lap, refusing to put it on the potentially dirty floor, and remained perfectly still, methodically scanning the busy, noisy dining room with his intelligent, dark eyes. Richard noticed this intense, probing gaze and was instantly forcefully transported back across the decades to fragmented memories of his own difficult childhood. He, too, used to observe absolutely everything when he was a little boy, growing up in a tiny, drafty apartment on the struggling outskirts of the city. He would anxiously scrutinize the printed prices on the rare occasions they saw a menu study, the exhausted expressions on the faces of the adults around him. Notice the tables that overflowed with uneaten wasted food, and watch his mother's worn, calloused fingers desperately searching the bottom of her purse for loose coins. He remembered her immense, heartbreaking courage as she smiled brightly and pretended that their precarious, terrifying financial situation was perfectly normal. Clara, the waitress, returned patiently noted their large orders on her green notepad with a nod of her head and quickly walked away toward the chaotic, steaming kitchen. Lily immediately began to recount a highly confusing, winding story about a recent school science fair, a stubborn bean sprout that absolutely refused to grow, despite being watered daily, and a boastful classmate who loudly swore she had genetically invented a lazy plant that only bloomed when everyone was completely asleep. Richard laughed warmly at all the appropriate moments, nodding along to his daughter's wild imagination, but his sharp attention inexplicably shifted when he heard a distinctly feminine voice, exceptionally low and cautious, drifting softly from the neighboring table situated just a few feet away. It was not a profoundly sad or broken voice, but rather gentle, measured, and firm, possessing the distinct recognizable tone of someone actively, desperately trying to protect an innocent child from the harsh realities of the world, even from the heavy, crushing burden of a simple restaurant bill. He discreetly turned his face just a fraction of an inch and saw Emily for the very first time. She was seated directly across from Sarah, a beautiful young girl who appeared to be almost the exact same age as his own beloved twins. The little girl wore a simple, pale yellow cotton dress that was impeccably clean and pressed, though Richard's sharp eyes caught a tiny, careful hand-sewn mending stitch near the left shoulder seam. Emily had her dark hair tied back simply with an unadorned elastic band, a worn, faded fabric tote bag resting securely and heavily on her lap, and the distinct calculating gaze of someone who mentally counts the exact cost of living before even allowing herself to take a deep breath. On the pristine white tablecloth between them lay a few silver and copper coins meticulously separated into small, neat piles, two highly crumpled $1 bills, and a single menu that was intentionally folded over and opened only to the specific page, displaying the absolute cheapest side dishes and appetizers available in the establishment. Sarah excitedly pointed a small, delicate finger at a glossy, colorful photograph of a decadent, towering chocolate tart. But she smiled softly and pulled her hand back without insisting, perfectly embodying the heartbreaking demeanor of a child who had learned far too early in her short life never to ask for anything that existed beyond the realm of absolute financial possibility. Richard felt a sudden, sharp, suffocating tightness in his throat, an emotional response born not of superficial, fleeting pity, but of a deeply rooted, almost painful memory being violently resurrected. He clearly saw his own late mother in that quiet, constrained, agonizingly familiar gesture. He vividly saw the tiny, freezing, cramped kitchen of their old, deteriorating apartment in the rougher neighborhood of Roxbury. He saw his mother's tired, rough hand counting individual pennies on the scratched formica table late at night, before deciding whether she could actually afford to buy a loaf of fresh bread or if she had to save the money for a necessary bus ticket for her grueling morning commute to her second job. He vividly, painfully remembered the bitterly cold winter nights when she cheerfully claimed she simply was not hungry just so he could scrape a meager second serving of rice and beans onto his own chipped ceramic plate. For many long, successful years, Richard had foolishly believed that achieving massive financial success, accumulating degrees, and building an empire meant permanently escaping those heartbreaking, traumatic scenes of poverty. However, on this particular chilly Boston night, sitting in a warm, expensive restaurant, he finally and profoundly understood that certain foundational scenes never truly leave our souls, no matter how much money sits in a bank account. They merely wait patiently, hiding in the shadows of our subconscious, waiting for another stranger's tired face to resurrect them with sudden, overwhelming clarity. Emily politely caught the attention of Clara the waitress and ordered a very modest, simple pasta dish for them to share, asking for a single extra plate. She asked in a hushed, almost embarrassed tone if the complimentary tap water could be served with a slice of lemon, because Sarah supposedly preferred it that way, and she quietly inquired if there were any hidden charges before fully committing to the order. Clara responded with genuine professional kindness, treating them with the exact same respect she afforded Richard. But his sharp eyes noticed the hidden, trembling embarrassment in Emily's pale fingers as she nervously smoothed the non-existent wrinkles of the tablecloth, as if desperately searching for hidden courage within the fabric's tight weave. Sarah, wonderfully oblivious to the heavy financial tension, continued to be a bright beacon of innocent joy, chattering enthusiastically away about a creative writing assignment she had recently completed at her public school. Emily smiled back radiantly, tilted her head affectionately, and asked engaging, thoughtful questions, acting as if this meager shared bowl of noodles were a grand, lavish royal celebration, and not a carefully balanced, terrifying mathematical equation that could derail their entire week's budget. Richard's lavish, steaming plates of expensive food finally arrived, carried out on a large silver tray, and set down with a flourish. Lily celebrated the arrival of her favorite baked ziti, as if she had just won a grand international championship trophy, clapping her hands together in pure delight. Luke methodically picked up his heavy silver fork, but his dark, intelligent eyes were also inexorably drawn to the adjacent table. The young boy, possessing an empathy far beyond his years, saw the organized, pathetic little stacks of coins, saw the little girl's bright, hopeful eyes, and saw her mother breathe a deep, silent, heavy sigh before nervously putting the small amount of remaining cash back into her worn fabric purse. Richard immediately noticed his son's intense, focused observation and gently, warmly placed a large hand on the boy's narrow shoulder. He did not do this to stop him from looking, nor to scold him for staring, but rather to silently, powerfully remind him to look with profound respect, understanding, and deep human empathy, rather than detached judgment. Luke instantly understood the unspoken powerful lesson his father was conveying. He respectfully lowered his eyes to his own full plate, began to eat his rich meal incredibly slowly, and after a few quiet, thoughtful minutes, he offered a timid, friendly, gap-toothed smile to Sarah when she happened to glance curiously in his general direction. The sweet little girl immediately responded with a tiny, joyful, almost secret wave of her small hand, a pure connection completely unburdened by the complex, painful world of adult finances. The loud, chaotic meal progressed around them, filled with the clattering of dishes and the roar of dozens of conversations, but Richard found himself completely, utterly unable to return his full emotional presence or mental focus to his own table. He managed to politely converse with Lily, carefully, listen to Luke's quiet, insightful remarks about his books, and generously compliment the rich, complex flavors of the food whenever Clara checked on them. Yet a large, heavy, melancholic part of his heart remained held captive by the discreet, metallic, clinking sound of the coins being counted at the next table. When Emily finally finished sharing the modest, inadequate portion of food with Sarah, ensuring the child ate the vast majority of it, she tenderly and lovingly wiped her daughter's mouth with a rough paper napkin and softly asked Clara for the final, dreaded bill. When it arrived, she double-checked the printed paper with anxious, darting eyes, her lips moving silently as she verified the math. Then she meticulously gathered the exact amount of coins, placed the 2 crumpled, faded dollar bills neatly on top of the small metal pile, and handed the entire sum over with a quiet, unwavering, majestic dignity that Richard respected from the very bottom of his soul. There was absolutely no dramatic exaggeration, no loud scene, no begging for sympathy. There was only a fiercely loving, determined mother managing to stretch the impossible, suffocating boundaries of the very little she possessed to give her child a moment of normalcy. Sarah stood up happily, carefully, holding against her small chest a folded paper napkin, upon which she had drawn a detailed, colorful picture of a cat during the meal. Before walking out into the cold night, she stopped, looked over at Luke, and offered him one last cheerful, vigorous wave. Lily, ever the highly curious and vocal one, immediately stopped chewing her garlic bread and asked her father loudly who the little girl with the yellow dress was. Richard softly, carefully replied that she was perhaps simply a very kind, imaginative little girl, and that kind people in this difficult world should always be greeted with equally delicate, respectful kindness. Lily cheerfully waved back at the departing girl, completely and blissfully unaware of the deep well of raw, painful emotion rapidly welling up in her father's eyes. Emily sincerely, warmly thanked Clara for her excellent service, tightly took her daughter's small hand in hers, and stepped out through the heavy door onto the brightly illuminated, freezing Boston sidewalk. The heavy glass door closed slowly behind them, silencing the roar of the street, but the poignant, powerful image remained permanently burned into Richard's mind, like a solitary, blinding candle left burning in a pitch-black, windowless room. He remained completely silent for several long, heavy seconds, lost in a sea of memories. His expensive, hand-painted plate still contained a significant amount of rich food that he suddenly had absolutely no appetite for. The twins' fruit juices were still half full, and the restaurant carried on exactly the same as before, utterly unchanged by the quiet tragedy of poverty that had just played out. Luke, always highly intuitive and sensitive to shifting moods, was the very first to notice the profound, heavy change in his father's usually jovial demeanor. He quietly, tentatively asked if his father was feeling sad about something from work. Richard smiled gently, pushing away his plate, adjusted his thick linen napkin on his lap, and whispered softly that he was not sad, but just deeply remembering a very important, incredibly wonderful person from his past. Lily immediately perked up, dropping her fork, and wanted to know eagerly if he was thinking about their grandmother, whom they had only known through beautiful faded photographs and warm bedtime stories. He confirmed her insightful guess with a slow, heavy nod of his head. He merely told his young, sheltered children that their grandmother, too, had once sat and nervously counted small copper coins at very similar, intimidating tables a long time ago, and because of those hard, defining memories, he could never, ever pretend to look the other way when facing certain harsh realities of the world. After they finally finished their decadent, sugary dessert, which Lily had indeed chosen with great fanfare, Richard discreetly motioned for Mr. Oliver to approach their corner table. He asked for his own substantial bill, paid it immediately with a black credit card, without even glancing at the exorbitant, heavily taxed total, and before gathering their winter coats to leave, he began to ask quiet, probing, respectful questions about Emily and Sarah. Mr. Oliver hesitated for a long moment, wiping his hands on his apron, not out of any malice or suspicion, but out of a fierce protective prudence for his vulnerable, regular patrons. Eventually, sensing the deep sincerity in Richard's voice, the kind restaurateur softly, quietly explained the heartbreaking situation. He revealed that Emily was a highly dedicated, underpaid municipal public school teacher working in one of the most underfunded districts in the city. He explained that she was a relatively recent grieving widow whose husband had passed away, suddenly leaving her drowning in medical debt. She was a fiercely devoted mother, a woman of very few complaints, but immense, unbreakable internal fortitude. He mentioned with a sad shake of his head that she visited the establishment perhaps once or twice every single month, always skipping her own meals at home with the sole desperate intention of offering her daughter a beautiful, normal moment of joy despite their harsh, grinding financial reality. Richard listened to every single tragic detail in absolute reverent silence, his heart breaking a little more with each sentence. By the time he helped the twins into their heavy winter coats and walked out into the biting, freezing night air, he already knew with absolute, unwavering certainty that he would return to this exact spot the very next morning. He would not return to buy superficial, ego-stroking gratitude, nor to forcefully, rudely invade this proud, struggling woman's private life. He intended only to silently, respectfully leave behind a small measure of the vital life-saving relief that his own desperate mother had so deeply needed, but never once received from an indifferent world. Inside the warm, luxurious car, while the twins energetically and loudly debated over who would get to finally choose the movie for their upcoming Friday movie night, Richard drove at a remarkably slow, deliberate pace through the icy streets. He felt deep in his bones, in the very core of his being, that the events of this night would not simply end here as a passing thought. There were certain monumental, life-altering decisions that initially blossomed from tiny, almost invisible, fleeting seeds of thought. Yet they carried more than enough silent, overwhelming power to completely alter the trajectories of entire struggling destinies. They were the kind of decisions that required absolutely no audience, demanded not a single round of applause, and sought absolutely no public reward or tax deduction. As he pulled into his quiet, secure driveway, listening to his children's laughter, Richard knew exactly what he had to do to balance the scales of the universe, even if just by a fraction. Early the following morning, long before the sun had fully broken through the thick gray Boston clouds, Richard dropped Luke and Lily off at their respective warm classrooms at their elite private elementary school and immediately drove his car back across town to the restaurant long before he even thought about heading to his towering corporate office building. The dining room of Oliver's Hearth was still entirely empty of patrons, filled only with the rhythmic sounds of heavy wooden chairs being aggressively aligned against the tables, the sharp acidic scent of lemon floor cleaner, and the loud metallic clanging of heavy pots and pans just beginning to awaken in the back kitchen as the prep cooks arrived. Mr. Oliver looked up from his messy administrative paperwork at the front wooden counter and instantly intuitively understood that this early morning visit was no ordinary casual stop for coffee. Richard did not request a table to sit at, nor did he ask for a cup of the morning brew. He merely asked in a low, serious tone if they could speak privately for a few uninterrupted minutes before the staff arrived in full force. The older man nodded understandingly, set down his reading glasses, and the two of them sat down near the large front window in the exact same spot where the quiet observation had begun the night before. Richard spoke in a remarkably calm, measured, and deeply respectful tone. He explicitly, clearly stated that he had absolutely no desire to expose Emily's struggles to the world, that he never ever wanted young Sarah to feel different or pitied compared to other children, nor did he wish to transform their deeply private, painful hardships into a public spectacle of wealthy charity. His sole unwavering concrete intention was to establish a permanent, massive, completely anonymous monthly credit account so that both the hardworking mother and her child could eat warmly, fully, and without an ounce of fear at this restaurant whenever their hearts desired. He earnestly, passionately asked Mr. Oliver to handle the entire delicate affair as if it were an old, forgotten promotional gift, or a random lottery originating from someone who intimately knew the crushing, humiliating weight of counting pennies in public. He wanted it to be framed as a gesture from someone who simply wished to permanently alleviate that terrible, suffocating weight for another deserving family. Mr. Oliver listened intently to the entire proposal without interrupting, once his weathered, wrinkled eyes growing visibly misty with unshed tears. When Richard finally finished speaking, laying out the logistics, the owner leaned forward and asked, his voice cracking slightly, if the wealthy man was entirely certain that a proud, independent woman like Emily would ever actually accept such a mysterious arrangement. Richard sighed softly, looking out at the freezing street, and honestly admitted that he did not know for sure. However, he deeply fundamentally believed that true life-changing help must always arrive on its knees, offering the utmost respect and preserving dignity, and never from a towering judgmental position looking down from a pedestal. The two men spent the next 20 minutes agreeing on every single meticulous, careful detail to ensure the plan's success. The massive financial credit would be securely permanently registered in the computer system without any attached name, without any visible printed receipt ever being generated, and without any formal billing process that Emily could trace. She would be completely free to order any nourishing, expensive meal for herself and Sarah without a second thought about the cost. And if she ever fiercely pressed for an explanation, Mr. Oliver was strictly instructed to tell her only that someone in the city had left this gesture behind out of sheer overwhelming gratitude for the unexpected blessings in his own life. Richard calmly handed over a tremendously substantial amount of cash in advance, an envelope thick enough to easily abundantly cover the next 3 full months of lavish meals, shook the older man's trembling hand with profound respect, and swiftly exited the building before his own rising, overwhelming emotions could force him to speak any further. Meanwhile, across the sprawling city, in a far less glamorous zip code, Emily was just beginning yet another exhausting, mathematically terrifying day of survival. She had woken up abruptly long before her cheap plastic alarm clock was set to ring, as she always did, lying in the dark and listening to the faint, rhythmic, annoying whirring of the broken ceiling fan and the peaceful, steady, beautiful breathing of Sarah, sleeping in the adjacent, cramped bedroom. The small, poorly insulated apartment was cloaked in total silence, but Emily's anxious mind was already racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, endlessly, frantically calculating numbers that never seemed to add up correctly. It was exactly 6 long, agonizing days until her next severely modest teacher's paycheck would finally clear the bank. Inside her worn, cracked leather wallet, there was a frighteningly, devastatingly small amount of cash, left barely enough to cover a few bus rides. The bright red, overdue electricity bill rested ominously on the scratched, stained surface of the small kitchen table, sitting right next to a handwritten grocery list that grew tragically, painfully shorter with every agonizing, tear-filled revision she made. Despite the crushing, invisible pressure sitting heavily on her chest, she forced herself to stand up, brewed a small pot of the cheapest, most bitter coffee available, carefully sliced a single bruising banana exactly in half, placed the slightly larger, better portion onto her daughter's chipped ceramic plate, and managed to somehow summon a bright, perfectly convincing, reassuring smile when Sarah finally appeared in the narrow doorway. Later that morning, at the bustling, severely underfunded municipal public school, Emily stood proudly before her chaotic classroom of 30 students and taught her lessons as if she carried absolutely no worldly worries or crushing debts upon her slender shoulders. She possessed a supernatural ability to compartmentalize her trauma for the sake of her students. She passionately, theatrically read a long historical chronicle aloud to her highly attentive students, painstakingly and lovingly corrected towering stacks of colorful, messy notebooks during her short lunch break, and patiently spent extra time helping a struggling, frustrated little boy named Tommy, who consistently, tearfully mixed up his vowels and consonants. She bravely and swiftly separated a minor escalating scuffle between two angry boys during the noisy, chaotic recess period, and still somehow miraculously found the precious time and emotional energy to draw tiny, perfect, encouraging stars on the math homework assignments that were particularly well done. During all of this daily chaos, Sarah, who was in a different classroom down the long hall, occasionally peeked through the small window in the door, observing her mother from a distance. The little girl felt nothing but immense bursting pride for her wonderful, smart teacher mother, completely incapable of imagining just how many sleepless, tear-filled, terrifying nights Emily endured alone in the dark, simply to keep that beautiful, strong pillar of dignity standing tall for them both. By the time the late freezing afternoon rolled around and the final school bell violently rang, the exhausted mother and daughter walked the several long, bitter, cold blocks back to their small apartment together, unable to justify the cost of the bus. Sarah excitedly, breathlessly chatted about her grand, ambitious plans to write a long, adventurous story regarding a brave little girl who magically discovers a glowing secret door hidden inside a grand, ancient public library. Emily warmly, enthusiastically replied that the highly imaginative idea was absolutely marvelous, and that she couldn't wait to read it, even as her exhausted, calculating mind secretly painfully worried about how she would possibly manage to afford the exorbitant cost of a brand-new clean notebook for her daughter's blossoming stories. When they finally reached their building, they were greeted by Mrs. Higgins, their elderly, kind-hearted neighbor who often watched Sarah for free when Emily had to stay late for mandatory staff meetings. Mrs. Higgins offered them a plate of slightly burnt cookies, a small gesture of community that Emily accepted with profound, near-tears gratitude. As they sat in their small living room eating the cookies surrounded by second-hand furniture and a mountain of ungraded papers, Emily looked at her daughter's happy face and felt a renewed, fierce determination. She would not let this poverty break them. She would continue to fight, to calculate, to sacrifice everything just to keep that innocent light shining brightly in Sarah's eyes for one more day. A few days later, just as the bitter evening began to cool the city even further, and the streetlights flickered on, Sarah innocently, quietly, asked if they could possibly, maybe have dinner at Mr. Oliver's lovely restaurant to celebrate finishing a hard week of school. She did not ask with annoying, loud insistence, nor did she throw a tantrum when she saw her mother hesitate. She merely asked with that heartbreakingly timid, fragile hopefulness that somehow terribly caused more